I love taking walks in places that are usually empty. The isolation and the serene ambience is something I always enjoy, especially during the hectic days of my high school exams. I would often sleep early and wake up even earlier, sometimes as early as 3 a.m., and just venture out to some desolate road before I start the activities of the day. I woke up one morning at around 2:15 a.m. and naturally decided to spend the early hours taking a nice refreshing walk. I got out of bed, got ready, and went on my way. It was a quiet morning, and the sky was still pitch black. I'd have thought there were dark clouds overhead since I couldn't see any stars, but then I didn't hear any thunder or feel droplets of rain. Soon I found myself on a relatively calm walk down a very empty and quiet road. Usually I'd hear animals bark or at least growl as I walked down that same road other mornings. But that day, it was so quiet I could hear a pin drop. The eerie silence made me shiver a bit, even though it wasn't that cold. There was something different about the air that day. It felt unusually oppressive for a late summer morning. I glanced up at the towering buildings, their silhouettes cutting through the night sky like a giant sentinel. That's when I saw her, a woman, standing motionless on top of an under-constructed building, her figure outlined against the yellow tinge of a loosely hanging light bulb. Something felt off, an unease settling in the pit of my stomach. As I approached the building, the chilling wind seemed to whisper cautionary tales in my ear, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to see if she was okay. I stepped into the empty lobby, the echoes of my footsteps intensifying the eerie stillness. Finally, I reached the rooftop, my breath heavy with anticipation, and there she stood, as motionless as a statue. She seemed normal. She was wearing pajamas, her hair unkempt as if she had just gotten out of bed. What struck me was that, even then, she did not move. Not a flinch, a twitch. It seemed like she wasn't even breathing. "Don't do it," I roared, my voice tearing through the silence of the night. "Let's talk it out. Step away from the edge." No response. It was as if she couldn't even hear me. "Miss, I stepped forward, intending on pulling her back to safety. But before I could, she had turned around to look at me, as if registering my presence for the first time. A tired face looked back at me, but there was something off about the way she just stared. All normal, except for the vacant, dead-eyed gaze that seemed to peer straight into my soul. I stepped back, not sure what to say when my foot collided on something, sending me tumbling backwards as I fell to the ground. I was about to say something, but I couldn't remember what. All I know was when I did stand back up, I was alone on that roof, with nothing but the whistle of a chilling breeze to keep me company. I thought of it the whole way back home, the tired, soulless face that I saw that morning. Needless to say, I don't go out on walks as much, at least not on such ungodly hours. I tried to look her up, that woman, but I never found anyone who resembled that face that had seared itself into my mind. Every now and then I pass by that road, and it seems the building, for all intents and purposes, have been abandoned. I did some research on the place, but there wasn't a lot about the owners. I found out that the building was scheduled to be demolished, and that the owners had discontinued it. I have heard rumors, however, about how the place was haunted. Many construction workers reported seeing strange figures and hearing voices when they worked there. To this day, I find myself thinking about that night, wondering about the strange events that conspired on that empty, abandoned building. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first heard about the unsolved case of the missing hiker. I had recently moved to the small, picturesque town of Willow Creek, nestled deep in the heart of the dense, foreboding forest. The locals whispered about the case in hushed tones, as if they feared they would be the next ones to vanish. At first, I dismissed the rumors as nothing more than small-town gossip. But the longer I stayed in Willow Creek, the more intrigued I became. It was impossible to ignore the air of unease that hung over the town like a dark, suffocating cloud. I couldn't help but to feel drawn to the mystery of the missing hiker. The story went like this. A young man named Daniel had ventured into the woods one fateful afternoon. An experienced outdoorsman, he had set off on a solo hiking trip, intent on conquering the treacherous trails that snaked through the forest. Despite his expertise, Daniel never returned. Search parties were organized, volunteers scoured the woods for weeks, but no trace of Daniel was ever found. I decided to do some digging of my own. I spoke to Daniel's friends and family, retraced his steps, and even ventured deep into the forest, searching for any clues that might explain his mysterious disappearance. The more I learned, the more I felt a sense of dread creeping over me. It was during one of my solo expeditions into the woods that I stumbled upon something truly chilling. As I trudged through the damp, mossy undergrowth, I spotted a dilapidated shack, half hidden by the dense foliage. My heart raced as I approached the structure, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The shack's door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit room. The walls were adorned with strange cryptic symbols that I couldn't quite decipher. In the middle of the room lay a dusty, tattered notebook. As I gingerly flipped through its pages, my blood ran cold. The notebook belonged to Daniel. In it, he had meticulously documented his own descent into madness. It detailed his strange encounters with unseen forces, the horrifying nightmares that plagued his sleep, and the eerie whispers that haunted him in the woods. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, followed by the unnerving words, "They're coming for me." I slammed the notebook shut, my hands trembling. The silence in the shack was shattered by an unsettling rustle in the bushes outside. Heart pounding, I cautiously peered through the gaps in the wooden walls. I saw nothing, but I could feel the presence of something or someone lurking just beyond the shadows. I bolted from the shack, sprinting through the forest as fast as my legs would carry me, the eerie whispers echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home in Willow Creek. I never ventured into the woods again, too terrified of what I had discovered. To this day, the case of the missing hiker remains unsolved, and the townspeople continue to whisper about the horrors that lurk in the shadows of the forest. It was a cold, bitter night in December. I was driving back home from a late work shift, the only soul on a never-ending highway that stretched out through an endless sea of snow-covered pine trees. The silence was occasionally disrupted by the crackling voice of some late-night radio jockey, but that night, even the radio seemed to share my sense of isolation. As my old pickup truck trudged on, the lonely beam of my headlights cut through the thick fog that had settled in. It was then I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, a hitchhiker. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up strangers, but the biting cold and long road got the better of my judgment. I pulled over and the figure approached. He was a man of average build, dressed in a tattered coat and jeans. His face was partly obscured by the collar of his jacket, pulled up high against the cold, but I could see his eyes sparkling oddly in the dim light. He introduced himself as John, thanked me for stopping, and got in. As we drove, he didn't say much, just stared out the window at the dark forest speeding by. Something about him felt off. I tried to brush it off as my mind played tricks, fueled by the eerie stillness of the night. An hour into the journey, we passed the dilapidated sign that read, "Gastown, 10 miles." I asked John if that was his stop, but he just shook his head, his eyes never leaving the window. Another hour passed. The radio had long since lost signal, leaving the cab filled with an oppressive silence. Suddenly, my truck's interior light flickered on. John had opened his door. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding. The truck skidded to a halt, and I turned to John, questions racing through my mind. But he was gone. The open door let in the freezing night air, and the only trace of John was the cold seat he'd vacated. I got out, shouting his name into the empty darkness. But there was no response, just the echo of my voice being swallowed by the night. Shaken, I got back in the truck and drove off. Not far down the road, I saw a sight that made my blood run cold. The same sign reading, "Gastown, 10 miles." I drove all night but never reached Gastown. The sign kept appearing every hour like a chilling reminder of my unwanted passenger. I finally pulled into a gas station at dawn, in a town that wasn't Gastown. I later found out that there was no Gastown in that area. It had been a ghost town for decades, abandoned and forgotten. And there were tales of a hitchhiker who roamed the nearby highways, forever destined to travel a road that didn't lead home. I still drive that highway for work, and every time I pass that old Gastown sign, the memory of that night sends chills down my spine. Because in my rearview mirror, just for a split second, I swear I can see a figure standing by the road, thumb outstretched, waiting for his next ride. If you're brave enough to hear more spine-tingling tales, click here for another journey into the unknown. It was a cold, rainy night, and the streets were empty as I walked home from work. I had just moved into a new neighborhood, so I was just getting used to the unfamiliar surroundings. The houses were old, and the street lights cast eerie shadows on the pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I approached my house, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My heart started to race as I thought of all the possible reasons why it might be open. I hesitated for a moment, deciding whether or not to go in. Eventually, I mustered up the courage and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The house was eerily quiet, and I could hear the sounds of my own breathing. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The power must have gone out. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, my shaky hand casting an unsteady beam of light across the room. I called out, "Hello," but there was no response. I proceeded cautiously, making my way through the dark house. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to check the basement first, thinking that maybe a fuse had blown. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder and damp, and the smell of mold and mildew filled my nostrils. When I reached the bottom, I noticed a single dim light bulb dangling from the ceiling. Its faint glow revealed a large, padlocked door in the far corner of the room. Curiosity piqued, I approached it and tried to peer through the small gap between the door and the frame. All I could see was darkness. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint scratching sound come from behind the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. The sound grew louder and more frantic, and I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I could hear raspy breathing and the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Panic set in, and I scrambled back up the stairs as quickly as I could. Once I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and barricaded it with a nearby chair. I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and hid under the covers, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I stayed there, trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. Eventually, I decided to call the police. When they arrived, they searched the house and discovered that the padlocked door in the basement led to a hidden room. Inside, they found a collection of disturbing items: a rusty cage, a filthy mattress, and chains bolted to the wall. It appears that someone had been living there, perhaps for years. As the police continued their investigation, they discovered that the previous homeowner had gone missing several years earlier. They suspected that he had been the one locked in the hidden room, but they were unable to find any trace of him. The case remains unsolved to this day. I moved out of the house as quickly as I could, but the experience still haunts me. I'll never forget the chilling feeling of being watched, or the sound of the desperate scratching behind the padlocked door. But that's not all. There's more darkness lurking in the shadows. Click here to explore other terrifying stories that would chill you to the bone. As the shadows of dusk fell upon the city, I found myself driving down a winding, unfamiliar road on the outskirts of town. I was returning from a business trip, and my GPS, as if possessed by some sinister force, had inexplicably rerouted me to this desolate, seemingly endless path. The thickening fog obscured my surroundings, but through the haze I could just make out the overgrown foliage that loomed ominously over the road. As I ventured deeper into the fog, I felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was deafening, the only sounds being the low hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. As my headlights carved through the gloom, I suddenly saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure was a young woman, her face ghostly pale and her eyes filled with terror. She wore a torn, blood-stained dress, and her feet were bare. I rolled down my window, hesitating for a moment, before I asked her if she needed help. I don't know, she stammered, her voice shaking. I don't remember anything. I just woke up here, and I don't know where I am or how I got here. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at her, but I couldn't leave her stranded. I offered to take her to the nearest town, and she reluctantly climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove, I tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to uncover some clues about her mysterious appearance. But she remained tight-lipped, her expression distant and haunted. We finally arrived at a small, nearby abandoned motel on the edge of town. It seemed like the safest place for her to stay until she could figure things out. I paid for her room and wished her good luck, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my bones. The next day, I returned to the motel, driven by a nagging curiosity. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Concerned, I asked the motel owner if he had seen her. He looked at me puzzled and told me that no one had checked in the previous night. I insisted that I brought her there, but he only shook his head, clearly thinking I was delusional. Feeling unsettled, I walked back to the room and peered through the window, only to find it completely empty. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman. I searched for any local news of missing persons or unsolved crimes, but found nothing. The more I dug, the more I became obsessed with the mystery. The story consumed me as I tried to piece together the puzzle of the lost, terrified woman who had vanished without a trace. And as the nights grew darker and the fog rolled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking just beyond the veil, watching and waiting for me to unravel the truth behind the chilling encounter on that desolate road. My name is James, and I'm a freelance journalist. I've always been drawn to mysteries, so when I heard about the strange occurrences surrounding an old, abandoned lighthouse on a remote island, I knew I had to investigate. The locals spoke of unexplained shadows, whispers in the wind, and a tragic past that seemed to haunt the island. I took a small boat to the island, the choppy waves making the journey treacherous. As I approached the rocky shoreline, I could see the lighthouse towering above the cliffs, its once white walls stained by years of exposure to the elements. The desolate island seemed to be shrouded in a constant, oppressive fog, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. I set up camp near the base of the lighthouse and began to explore the island. The lighthouse itself was locked, but I managed to find a way through a rusted, broken window. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the smell of mold filled my nostrils. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, but it felt as if time had stood still, with the old keeper's belongings still scattered throughout the rooms. I spent hours poring over old documents, trying to piece together the lighthouse's tragic history. The last keeper, a man named Arthur, had mysteriously vanished one stormy night, leaving behind a wife and a young daughter. His body was never found, and his family eventually moved away, too heartbroken to remain on the island. As night fell, I decided to head back to my campsite. As I walked through the dark, foggy landscape, I began to notice strange shadows flickering at the edge of my vision. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the eerie feeling that I was being watched grew stronger with each step. Suddenly, I heard a distant whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It seemed to be calling my name, urging me to follow it. I hesitated, unsure if I should trust the ghostly voice, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the whispers, which led me deeper into the fog and towards the island's rocky shoreline. As I reached the water's edge, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to take on a more solid form. I squinted through the thick fog, trying to make out what was happening. It was then that I saw her. A ghostly figure in a tattered white dress, standing at the edge of the cliffs, her gaze fixed on the stormy sea below. The figure resembled Arthur's wife, who, according to the documents I found, had taken her own life after her husband's disappearance. The whispers intensified, and I could now hear her voice clearly, filled with sorrow and despair. She spoke of a terrible secret, one that had led to the death of her husband and the destruction of her family. I tried to approach her, but as I drew closer, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving behind only the echoes of a mournful voice. I searched the cliffs and the surrounding area for hours, but I found no trace of her, or any clue to the secret she had spoken of. I spent several more days on the island, but the ghostly figure never reappeared. The shadows and whispers continued to haunt me, and I could feel the island's tragic past weighing heavily on my soul. I left the island with more questions than answers, unable to shake the feeling that there was a darker truth hidden beneath the surface. The mystery of the shadowed lighthouse remains unsolved, but the island's chilling secrets continue to haunt my dreams. I can't help but wonder what terrible fate befell